Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event on a beautiful autumn day. My name is Anu Anipindi. I'm currently in my final semester of dual master's program, doing master's in public administration and criminal justice with gender-based violence as my focus. Hence, being here. A few years ago, my life took a transformative turn when I began volunteering as a court appointed special advocate, CASA. This experience inspired me to return to school and pursue my second and third master's degrees to better advocate for children. Along the way, I also became a volunteer victim advocate with Broomfield PD. Currently, I'm working with the Colorado Children's Alliance on my capstone project, focusing on comparing statutes related to child advocacy centers and child maltreatment across US states, and recommending improvements to legislation in Colorado. I'm honored to be moderating today. Thank you. Before we dive in, I would like to thank the Center for Community Safety and Resilience, co-directed by Dr. Crow and Dr. Sheila Husk, for making this event possible, along with Didi Flynn. Thank you, Didi. Our School of Public Affairs event coordinator, Dean Paul Teska, was here. Oh, okay. And other supporters across campus, including the Chancellor's Office, students, faculty, and staff. This event is part of the Thrive series launched this semester by the CCSR at the School of Public Affairs. Tonight, our focus is on intimate partner violence. Just to provide some context, over 1 in 3 women, that is 35.6%, and 1 in 4 men, that is 28.5%, in the US have experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Now, let me introduce our distinguished panelists for the evening. Thank you for the honor. Jill Brogdon, and the Human Trafficking Program Coordinator for the Colorado Department of Public Safety, Division of Criminal Justice, Office for Victims Programs. In this capacity, Ms. Brogdon assists in coordinating the work of Colorado Human Trafficking Council, to which she was appointed by Governor Hickenlooper as the first sex trafficking survivor representative. She was also an advisor for the Public Awareness Working Group, assisting in the development of states' award-winning public awareness campaign. This is humantrafficking.com. As a survivor, she has testified in support of Colorado Child Sexual Abuse Accountability Act in front of House Judiciary Committee before they were passed. Thank you for your work. Dr. Colley is an accomplished staff researcher at the Office of Domestic Violence and Sex Offender Management within the Division of Criminal Justice, Colorado Department of Public Safety. In her role, she provides research support to the Sex Offender and Domestic Violence Offender Management Boards, prepares legislative reports, and spearheads in-house research projects. She holds a PhD in forensic psychology. She has a strong background in clinical criminal psychology. Dr. Coley's work focuses on the prevention and treatment of interpersonal violence. She is dedicated to advancing research and policy in this critical area. She has published multiple research papers on rape, sex offender treatment, cognitive distortions in child molesters, to name a few. Thank you. Rachel Rodriguez is a dedicated and passionate advocate for survivors of violence with over 15 years of experience at the local, state, and national levels. She is currently the Associate Director at Rose Andem Center and has previously served in key roles such as Director of the Domestic Violence Outreach Program at Family Tree, Bilingual Advocate, and Crisis Line Volunteer Supervisor at Safe House Denver, and Manager of Hotline Services for the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Throughout her career, Rachel has worked tirelessly to raise awareness of domestic violence and to support efforts to end it. A defining moment in her advocacy work came when she realized the power of personal connection by simply addressing a homeless client by name, transforming both the interaction and her approach to supporting survivors. a lesson she continues to carry with her today. Thank you. Catherine Miller is an award-winning activist and educator with an extensive experience in advocacy for survivors of interpersonal violence and human trafficking. She is currently serving as the director for Phoenix Center, our own Phoenix Center at Aurora. Catherine also teaches undergraduate students at MSU Denver and the community college online system in both the gender, women, and sexuality studies and the psychology departments. She teaches graduate courses for the Graduate School of Professional Psychology at the University of Denver. To provide crisis intervention and community response to trafficking survivors with a laboratory to combat human trafficking, prevention education through the Blue Bench, trauma therapy at the Aurora Strong Resilience Center. She has won Outstanding Women Award from Institute of Women's Studies and Services, Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Award from MSU Denver, Independent Research Award, to name a few. So, some logistics. Our panel discussion will be for an hour. We will start with 45 minutes for the panelists to respond to the questions, the 4 questions, and that we prepared for tonight, leaving the last 15 minutes for the audience questions. I kindly ask that you hold your questions until the end so that we can give the panelists enough time to respond to our questions. So are we ready to get started? The first question, how do you define intimate partner violence and how do you distinguish this term from domestic violence and interpersonal violence? In what ways does the definition of intimate partner violence frames your experience in the field? It's open for discussion. Anyone would like to take it up? Who would like to start?
Well, let me first start by thanking you all for coming. It's really an honor to be sharing with all of you. So as my introduction said, I'm a survivor of human trafficking. And when I looked at the question, I thought, intimate partner violence, I did not consider him to be an intimate partner because I was a child. I was 14. But as an adult, if you took myself and him and put them together, then yes, it definitely was intimate partner violence. He tricked me into believing that he was my partner and was going to take care of me for the rest of my life. And so the way I define intimate partner violence is someone in a position of trust taking advantage of another person and forcing them to do something that they would not normally do, and using that intimacy as sort of a weapon to make them do something. For instance, my trafficker told me if I loved him, then I would go be with these other people. And as a 14-year-old child, of course, I'm thinking, oh, well, I'll do anything for this man. And I imagine as an adult, there would be, I probably would have said, hell no, I'm not going to do that. But he also used a lot of threats to me and had a gun and threatened me with physical violence if I didn't do what he told me to do. So to me, as I said, intimate partner violence is taking advantage of that intimacy, and it's a person in a position of trust. My trafficker was a school teacher who told me that he loved me. And so I look at that and I think I immediately became an intimate partner because I had several vulnerabilities that made me listen to him. So that's my definition of intimate partner violence.
Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Rachel as well. And thanks as well for turning up and inviting me to come along. In terms of how to respond or add on to that. I come to this field largely more from the treatment of the offender side of things. Like I used to work as a clinical psychologist back in my home country of New Zealand, and then I kind of moved into more of a academic kind of role. And now I work for the Office of Domestic Violence and Sex Offender Management, and we have the Domestic Violence Offender Management Board, where we set standards and guidelines around treatment for post-conviction domestic violent offenders, and also accreditation and kind of training of the people that are approved to do that treatment. So I kind of look at it like what do we put in policy, what do we put in research to kind of define this? And so my take on it is that, you know, intimate partner violence is violence, abuse, coercion, manipulation, you know, by a current or a former partner to the victim. And some of those things are highly illegal, and some of those things aren't that illegal, or just won't be, because it's going to include things like psychological abuse. It's going to include things like the grey area of stalking, that kind of stuff. So some things are in that IPV definition, some things are illegal and some things aren't. But then in comparison, when we think of domestic violence, that is criminally defined in law, and that's how we get to work with the clients that are coming, or indirectly with the clients that are coming into the treatment programs. And that's defined under statute, and it's the act or the threat of violence to a person. And it can also include other sorts of crimes if it's against an intimate partner or a past intimate partner, and it's designed to hurt or punish them, that sort of thing. So it can be damaging their property, can be injuring their pet, it can be those other sorts of things. And in Colorado, we find an underlying, what we call an underlying factual basis of domestic violence, where it's proved in that legal setting that this act of violence or these acts of other crimes were designed as part of a domestic violence or intimate partner violence pattern. And so that for me is where I kind of come into interaction with this stuff.
Catherine?
Okay, we can hear me? Lovely. So I think we're all just going to add on to each other. That's what you're going to hear pretty much the whole time. So in addition to that, so I work on the survivor side, right? So I don't work with offenders. I work with folks who have experienced these forms of violence. So the only thing I think I would add to what you said is what we're talking about are dynamics of power and control, right? Where someone is trying to take power and control away from somebody else to maintain it for themselves. We literally can't talk about any of these forms of violence without talking about elements of power and control. So I think that that's very important. And what distinguishes, you've heard intimate partner violence, domestic violence, interpersonal violence. These terms are often used interchangeably. To me, they don't always mean the same thing, right? So my office, for example, serves survivors of interpersonal violence. We define that as relationship violence, family violence, sexual violence, stalking, and harassment. So there's a larger umbrella that fits under that, right? So intimate partner violence or relationship violence can fit within that. I tend to stray away from the term domestic violence because it brings up very specific connotations for people about what violence looks like. The term domestic, I think for most people, assumes that we're talking about people who live together, who are probably married. And there's a lot of heteronormative assumptions around that, right? So we're already painting a picture then about who can experience these forms of violence and who we should take seriously if they come forward and report or need services. So I tend to stray away from domestic violence because of its very traditional ties to how people think about violence, how it's coming from a cisgender man to a cisgender woman. Do those things happen? 100%, absolutely. A lot of the people that we serve at our office are cisgender women, and anyone of any identity can experience these forms of violence, right? And so the language that we choose to use when we discuss these issues is really important because it takes away that element of then who do we believe when they say that they've experienced these forms of violence? So I think making those distinguishments between what we're actually talking about when we use these terms, that language is incredibly important. So I guess my encouragement would be maybe don't use domestic violence, even though that's the legal terms that are going to be used, right? So if we're talking about the law, domestic violence is going to be the term that is used. But when we talk about it in any other space, I'm always saying intimate partner violence or interpersonal violence to make it a little bit more encompassing.
Thank you.
So I am using the lens as a lifetime advocate, providing services and support to individuals experiencing domestic violence. And that's the term that we use as advocates. I've been working in a shelter, a confidential domestic violence shelter. I have done outreach. I've done community education, and how we define it as advocates, and just really kind of sharing what everyone else has shared is we do use these terms interchangeably. In the state of Colorado, under the statute, it does define domestic violence as intimate partner violence. I came from Texas, where domestic violence meant people in the domicile. So it had a different meaning there as well. So here in Colorado, when we talk about domestic violence, we ask, are you experiencing domestic violence? And then we get more specific. Is this with an intimate partner? So this is how we define it. And we can define, then they ask a little bit more, we ask a little bit more questions about the relationship. And it can be any type of intimate relationship. And we don't really, it's really hard. Then what do you define as intimacy? We have had people who never actually had the actual act of a sexual act, but there was other things that made the relationship feel intimate. And so it can be very nuanced, and depending on where you go to. All the Denver metro areas that provide services to survivors of domestic violence absolutely define it as intimate partner violence. And that's how they will do the screening for admission into a domestic violence shelter. So, we have had conversations in the field about moving and being more specific about using the term intimate partner violence. And it's a trend that we're starting to see and starting to use much more often.
The entire idea that there was always a threat, and knowing that the firearm was there was such a controlling mechanism. That brings us to the next question. What factors, both at the individual and structural level, contribute to the problem of IPV, intimate partner violence? Also, what role do you think gender plays in this problem?
So that's a super loaded question. That could be the whole question of like the only thing that we talk about for an entire hour, and like could talk about longer. Like there are like 16-week classes that address like just that question. So I'll say what we're going to offer is probably a very like a simplistic and not as nuanced response as I think that question actually deserves. But I think that there are a lot of root causes for why these forms of violence happen, both on an individual and a systemic or structural level. So I think that we have like root causes that are based in colonization. I think that's a big part of it. And thinking about like who is worthy of existing and who isn't worthy of existing, and how we see forms of violence that we saw very, very early on, like in the creation of our world, that perpetuate within these forms of violence now. I think traditional gender roles definitely play a role in terms of how we think about these forms of violence or why they occur. No one is ever going to fit perfectly into this gendered box that society has normed for us. And that causes a lot of problems in terms of how we interact with the world, how we think other people see us, how we act in relationships, how we feel in relationships. It makes a really, really big difference. And I think an undercurrent of that, like particularly when we're talking about male violence, is toxic masculinity. I don't think that there's a way to get away from discussing that as a term as well, because unfortunately men are a large like body of people who are perpetuating forms of violence against people of all identities. And that's rooted in the idea that in order for men to be masculine, they have to be violent, right, and abusive. And that is a horrible narrative that we've created in our world for men to have to live by. And is really, really unfortunate. I think that the media is also a large driver of like why we see these things happen, right? So there's a lot of romanticization of how violence in relationships is supposed to look, like particularly in that courting phase, right? So like a lot of behaviors are actually very unhealthy, very abusive, they're stalking, right? So like there's a great little like YouTube video. It's called Stalking for Love. It's like 20 minutes long. I would highly recommend watching it. They go through some of like the most classic like rom-com movies, which, you know, for people who are socialized as women, you've probably seen them and you're like, yes, I loved that growing up and like really wish that Ryan Gosling would totally like hang off of a Ferris wheel for me. I'm a millennial, so maybe that's just my generational era, but like, so find your own Ryan Gosling, but you know, like put it in context. When really it's just like, no, he's like forcing her to date him in the Notebook. Like it's really, really problematic, but we romanticize these things and then people expect them to happen within relationships. So then when we see things like love bombing happening at the beginning of relationships, which is actually a red flag, we don't see that as a red flag because we're taught by society that in fact, like we should want these things to happen. And then from our structural level, I think that what is helpful and also not helpful is that we've tied these things to law. I can see why it happened. And also, I don't believe it has helped survivors almost literally at all. People fall through the cracks in order for things to actually be taken seriously and be prosecuted. There's a lot of evidence that has to be presented, and a lot of that evidence can't be presented, right?
So we can keep going on and on about it.
So like these are some of the things that I see, and I'm sure that everyone else will elaborate on those even further. I could think of like 12 other things, but that's my neat box, as neat as I could make it.
You said a lot of great things, Catherine. Thank you. Especially the power and control. That's a huge piece of, it's a huge factor in what happens in intimate partner violence. For me, I look at the vulnerabilities of a person. Reflecting on my own experience, I was very vulnerable. My parents lost their first son when I was 3, and it completely shifted the whole family dynamic. I'm aging myself, but that was back in the 60s. And it was taboo to get help from a psychologist. So their help, quote unquote, was alcohol. And as a result, my siblings and I suffered a lot of neglect. And so when this teacher came and approached me, it seemed like somebody loved me. And so I was very receptive to that. So I feel like, and that's just one vulnerability. I mean, we could do a whole evening on vulnerabilities. And one of the things that in the human trafficking realm that we're trying to pull away from is creating a list of indicators that would say that this person is being trafficked, a checklist, if you will. And rather than doing that, we're looking at it from a whole person approach. And what does this person need? What does this person in front of me need? Instead of saying, did you have sex for a sandwich? That's irrelevant. What do you need right now? Do you need a place to sleep? Do you need some transportation? Do you need medical attention? Do you need mental health? So those pieces to me are more important on the structural level rather than going through a checklist. I think that you should always have those indicators in your mind because of course that is going to help us get services for someone, but it shouldn't be part of the interviewing process. And you know, you can look at those indicators later, but when you have someone in front of you, look at what they need first. I might have gotten off track a little bit, but
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I might add on to that, and obviously we can't be super comprehensive, but I do like the things that I've been hearing. One of the things that I think there is a whole lot of really good scholarly work looking at this very, very big field. And one of the challenges that I think it's important to remember when you look at what's being said by researchers, by different parts of the system and stuff, is that information comes from very different places. So, I have some notes down here. It's like, are we learning this from community members, or are we learning this from people that are in the criminal justice system? Are we learning this from survivors, or are we learning this from offenders? Are we learning it from heterosexual intimate partners? Are we learning it from same-sex intimate partners, and so on and so forth? And then we can carve that up with, teens versus adults. We can carve it up across the different cultural groups that we have in our neighborhoods and whatnot. And we get a piece of the picture, but we often end up with either overlapping or conflicting kinds of things. And I think a real takeaway is to just really think there's different parts of the problem. Some, like what you're talking about with human trafficking, is so extremely serious and severe, but then we also have teens smacking each other up, and we've got different levels of things going on as well, and different factors might be playing a role in that, and also the potential for change is potentially different for different people as well. One of the things that I think is really interesting that is emerging quite clearly when we look at the criminal justice side of things, and when we look at more serious kind of community surveys, and we think, what tells us if another domestic violence offence or another period of severe interpersonal violence is going to occur in this relationship? And it's that degree of coercion that's actually embedded in the relationship seems to be a really good predictor of whether we're going to see more violence happen. And then equally, when we see really serious violence like rape, like strangulation, like excessive stalking and whatnot, then we see more lethal IPV. So those are a couple of take-homes.
Thank you, Dr. Cole.
So this is when I got the questions and looked at them, I thought, wow, we could spend the whole entire time on this question. And I thought, which way do I really want to go with this? Because you can, and as the panelists have said, and using their lens and their education and experience. And I thought at looking at the approach of really understanding, how challenging it is to talk about what causes domestic violence, what is the root cause of it. And it's so incredibly complex, as you have already heard. And I thought, thinking about my family dynamics, I identify as Mexican American, and my family came from Corpus Christi, Texas. And my grandmother was married at the age of 16. My grandfather married her when he was 21. And as a child, you don't really understand all of this stuff. But she had 18 children, 16 lived. I mean, I didn't even plan 2 children, and that was too much for me. And as an adult, it made me realize that being as a Mexican American, everyone knew that my grandfather was abusive. Everyone knew about it, and no one did anything about it, even family members. And I really had to, as an adult, really think about my grandmother, who lived this way her entire life, being abused by this man, not just physically, sexually, emotionally, psychologically, and financially, completely dependent on him. Would have never, ever thought, and my grandmother was very, very Catholic, so would have never even thought to have left my grandfather. So that I just really, as an adult, understanding domestic violence, really started thinking what contributed to all of this. One, our culture, really understanding this toxic machismoism, and really understanding male privilege, understanding all the complexities of what this individual who, I was never ever close to, and really later understood why I wasn't. I didn't feel anything. I was very drawn to my grandmother. And this is what drives my passion now. And so when I research and do a lot of the work that I do now, I think about what does cause it? Because I work every day to work myself out of a job. I want to be part of the solution. And so when I start looking what can be the root causes, I see lots of correlations. Everyone wants to believe that drugs and alcohol are contributing factors, when in fact they're high correlations, but not a causation. PTSD, another thing. Then I look at, okay, are we looking at our values, our belief systems, Are we looking at how we were raised? And it becomes really challenging. But at the end of the day, as an individual, everyone has a choice to make, and it is a matter of choice. And that's what I see as an individual level, even if it's a learned behavior and people grew up that way. And yes, it can mean that maybe someone would grow up to be someone who chooses to use abusive behaviors or become themselves a victim of abuse. But really and truly, everyone has choices to make, and it is a choice. And at the systemic level, I want to just echo, and I'll make it really quick. I just want to echo what Catherine said. There's so many influences, whether it be media, whether it be the music that you hear, just in society, how we normalize, and not only normalize, but romanticize some of the especially subtle signs of abusive behaviors.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you, but that kind of falls into the next question that we are doing. Will you please describe the prevention and intervention efforts, advocacy programs, or community support services with which you are familiar in your line of work or experience? Are there any that you think are particularly effective or ineffective? If so, why? Do you want to start, because you already started on that topic?
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. So I work at the Rosandum Center, and we're a family justice center model based on providing services to survivors of domestic violence that has this one safe place to come to that provides these wraparound services. This is a model we were the first to open up in the state of Colorado. And since then, Jefferson County opened up their family justice center, and Adams County is in the process of opening theirs. This is a really best practice approach to providing services to survivors of domestic violence because we're all in one place. We have civil legal where you can get protection orders. We have counseling in one place. We have Denver Health as a co-located partner. And so someone can come in and literally just stay in one place and receive all these services. And we also have systems-based Denver Police Department's domestic violence units is housed in our facility, as well as the DA's office, probation, pretrial, all of these that provide all the support to survivors. When I worked in the other field, we would have to send survivors to other locations, and they may make it to one because one, transportation, getting there, getting time off of work, getting, childcare. And by the way, we do provide childcare, and we try to eliminate all barriers to accessing our services. And we provide even transportation and Lyft rides to get them to come to see us. We provide childcare on site. So I see that as a definitely supportive service. We also have child and youth programming where we work with children who have been traumatized and witnessed domestic violence. And we provide monthly events, and we have a 1-week camp. It's a resiliency based on hope theory so that children can be children and do horseback riding and yoga and swimming and hiking. And this is, for me, just prevention excites me. It fuels the energy and the work that I do because we have to really end and break that cycle. So prevention, can come from using the social ecological model that was put out by the Center for Disease Control. And it's 4 layers. It starts with the individual and knowing what can you do to help address these. One, you can be a courageous bystander when you see things that you see that may not be right, or someone, check on someone, give them resources, educate yourself. These awareness events, fabulous. And you also have the power to use your voice when you vote. I mean, look at things that matter to you. Gender-based violence, are those, on the ballot? There's a ballot now. A lot of our social services are losing funding through what we call VOCA. That's a federal funding where criminals would put money into a pot and pay their fees. Now we're, doing great things like restorative justice, but there's no money for survivors. On the ballot, we have something that's called Prop KK, and that money is come from an excise tax on ammunition sales, and it's really just look at it, whether you agree with it or not. It does, is money would be 6.5%, I think it is, that would go to serve all victims in the state of Colorado for victim services. So, I mean, you have that power, and just talking about it, because talking about intimate partner violence, silence just breeds more violence. And so I encourage you to educate yourself, talk about it, and get involved, whether it means volunteering, donating what you can, donating, ask all of us, we're here to help and talk to you about helping to talk to your friends, your family, and you can make a difference, and it starts with you.
And that's Proposition KK
KK.
for mental health and victim services.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going. That was great. Thank you for all that wonderful information. I actually served in a fellowship where we went through the whole how to prevent human trafficking and how to serve survivors. And our model was the whole person approach and having a one-stop shop. So I thoroughly support that. And I knew Rosandum was like that. There's also an organization called Porchlight out in Lakewood that has identical services that Rosandum does. For my organization, what we did for prevention is we created an award-winning public awareness campaign about human trafficking, and it's called thisishumantrafficking.com. We actually won an Emmy for our public awareness campaign, and we've had people from all states from all around the country ask if they could use our model. And what it is there's short little videos on the website that are taken from survivors. There were several survivors, including myself, that advised this program, and we helped them develop the stories. They're all kind of based on Colorado human trafficking that has happened here. And they're so short, but very powerful. And they show you all the different types of human trafficking, including labor trafficking, which none of us have touched on, but that, to me, that's a form of intimate partner violence, because you could say that your employer is kind of a partner to you. Well, they are a partner. And if they're forcing you to work for no wages, that is, to me, an act of violence. So there's the thisishumantrafficking.com, our public awareness campaign. And then I also am a huge advocate for training in schools. It's incredibly difficult to get into the schools. We're making some progress. I do speak a lot at schools because that's where my trafficking took place. But as I said, it's difficult to get in because schools don't want to know that that actually happens in their community. And it's not necessarily a teacher or someone at the school that's doing it. It's, it could be family members, a neighbor, an uncle. So it's really good to have training of the administration and then eventually to the students. Depending on the age, we have different curriculums so that we're not going to traumatize the kids, but teach them what coercion looks like. I learned from the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking a great little exercise on coercion. Just one person has a piece of candy and the other person is trying to get the piece of candy away from them, and they're not allowed to touch them. They just have to say things to make them give them that piece of candy. And it teaches the kids what it's like to give up something that's yours. What does that feel like? And how to recognize and how to find the courage to say, no, you can't have my piece of candy or my body either. So I think those types of trainings are critical, and teaching administration. One of the things I tell in my presentations is that I used to fall asleep in class. I was up all night, but I'd go to school and I'd fall asleep in class. Believe it or not, I was a straight A student, but my teacher would yell at me and say, what were you doing all night? Did you sneak out and go watch TV all night? Because back then we didn't have phones, instead of punishing me and making me feel bad, maybe if he asked, is something going on at home? Is something happening that what is happening to make you not sleep? So training teachers to look for things like that and understand that these little quirks, like if a kid comes in dressed in the same clothes for 5 days, you could say you're just lazy and don't want to change clothes, but maybe there's more going on, that they're not changing clothes because they don't have any other clothes. So I'm a strong advocate for teaching in schools, teaching administration and teachers and innocent bystanders. I have several classmates that have told me, oh, we always wondered if something was going on, but we didn't know what to say. And of course they didn't, because they were 14 also. But if they had a little bit of training to teach them, go to a trusted adult and see what you can do from there, that might have changed things in my life. So I think I'm a strong advocate for training in schools and our public awareness campaign.
Thank you, Rachel. Doug.
I mean, I'll try and be really, really quick because I know we're running out of time. So I would just echo what my colleagues have said here. And I also believe that education is extremely important. There are a lot of really amazing organizations that do a lot of amazing work. And I'll tell you that even though there are a lot of organizations that do that, we're still not enough. We are overtaxed and without enough staff to serve all the people who need to be served. And it puts us in a model where we have to be reactive instead of proactive. And I think that that's really problematic when we're talking about why these forms of violence continue. So the Phoenix Center at Auraria, we are located here on campus. How many people are campus affiliated? Just wondering. Lovely, great to see you. We're in Tivoli 227. It's right across from the pizza place. So if you can find pizza, you can find us. And sometimes our office smells like pizza, so that's a win. Unless you're 7 months pregnant, and then it's kind of not, because then you want to eat pizza all the time. But we are the campus's tri-institutional interpersonal violence prevention and advocacy center. So we actually do both prevention education programming on campus, including educational workshops. You've probably seen maybe the Red Flag campaign outside of the health center that we do for Relationship Violence Awareness Month, the Clothesline Project in the Tivoli for Sexual Assault Awareness Month in April. If you've been in some of the bathrooms, not on this side of campus, but on the other side of campus, we have bathroom signs to kind of raise awareness. We have a great Instagram. Please follow us. It's at Phoenix Auraria. We post a lot of cool things. We have a podcast. And then we do advocacy services for people who are either experiencing or are impacted in some way by these forms of interpersonal violence. So any student, faculty, or staff member who is affiliated with our campus, whether they be from CU Denver, MSU Denver, or the Community College of Denver, can come and speak with a confidential advocate about what's going on. And we'll do our best to help you with everything that we can. We're not a one-stop shop. We do often have to refer out. We refer to the Rosandum Center frequently, particularly for legal services. They have a great organization in there called Project Safeguard, who is just a beacon of light in the world. Love them so much. We also have a 24/7 crisis helpline. We're one of the few offices on campus that can literally be reached 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on Christmas, whenever someone might need something. So if you all are wondering how, well, now that I've met this person and she's kind of awkward and maybe a little funny, how do I work with her and do the things that she does? We need helpline volunteers. So if that's something that you're interested in, please stop by our office and pick up an application. We'd love to have you.
Thank you, Catherine.
I'll go quickly here as well. And obviously my involvement with interpersonal intimate partner violence is on the other side. It's when people are convicted of a domestic violence offence. And so we have a board which is statutory mandated in Colorado called the Domestic Violence Offender Management Board, and it's a 19-person board. It has mental health treatment providers, has treatment victim advocates, it has prosecution lawyers, defence lawyers, with public defenders. We have victim services. So it's got judges, and so it sort of brings a whole lot of stakeholders together to help set these regulations and guidelines for what should be going on in treatment and how we're going to sort of ensure that the treatment is evidence informed and kind of client centered, right? A couple of aspects that might be interesting to you to know is that there's over 170 mental health practitioners certified or approved in Colorado to deliver those treatments right across the state. Most of that treatment's getting delivered in group settings, but there is flexibility and individualization to do individual work with people or to add individual work. A couple of the aspects that I think really help Colorado have a very good approach to treating people once they've been convicted is that everybody's subject to a comprehensive risk needs assessment before they begin treatment. Then from there, they will be placed into a level of treatment based on their treatment needs and the likelihood assessed that they're going to continue to have problems. And so at the lower end, it may be group treatment only, and at the higher end, it's going to be group treatment plus a number of individual contacts and adjunct treatment for substance use or mental health or other sorts of problems like that. We don't have a set week model for this sort of treatment, like places like California, as a contrast, has a 52-week model. Some other parts of the US have a 26-week model. We have a model which is based on an individualized treatment plan where people need to address the assessed risks and needs that they present with by achieving core treatment competencies. Things like being able to take responsibility for their behavior, being able to acknowledge the nature of their violence, being able to learn some of the intergenerational connections and patterns that have put them in this situation or contributed to their pattern, and so on and so forth. We also tend to have, the providers tend to use cognitive behavioural models alongside other models that they may want to use as well. So it's often about looking at core changes in the way that we think, that the way that we believe that this is okay, how we think about what's right as the way to resolve a problem, and then also teaching a lot of self-regulation skills so that once we get people kind of really committed to that idea that they do not want to do this and they're going to cease, then how do we actually make that happen for people? Another interesting thing I think about the model that makes it successful is that in statute, it's written that it's to stop domestic violence offending and protect the victims. So every multidisciplinary treatment team has to have a treatment victim advocate on that team, and it's their job or role to try to reach out and see if survivors want contact with the treatment victim advocate. And they can do that in a way that's entirely confidential to the perpetrator that's doing treatment. And then that person the victim advocate can serve as kind of a liaison between the survivor and the treatment team. And to some extent, they can be involved in later parts of treatment where there might be accountability types of sessions, or they can choose to have absolutely no involvement at all. It's entirely based on what the survivor wants and needs. So those are some things that make Colorado a little bit more unique than some of the other states in the US. And then in terms of that very final question, I'm just going to jump ahead so then I don't have to circle back around to it. I was going to say, so what do we need to do? Education, education, education. We need more people that are interested in working in this field. There's definitely a shortage, and I really feel for survivor services with their cuts in funding coming. We could do with heaps more mental health practitioners that want to work with individuals who've got convicted for domestic violence. So if that's something that interests you, we have the opportunities in our office to try and coordinate internships, which are more like a policy research sort of internship. We can help to connect people with providers in the community that do that work, that may have internships and kind of shadowing opportunities out there as well. And then the other thing that I think because I saw in the question that was about university resourcing, we need research because it's really helpful to be able to draw on the research that's going on in other parts of the US and whatnot. And we do have some here in Colorado, but we can create better local solutions when we have better local research. And so by that, I mean, we need to be able to evaluate our programs. We need to be able to evaluate what brings people into this criminal justice setting where they're committing these kinds of crimes. We need to look at, does our model help survivors? Is there ways to improve it? Can we do a better job? Are we meeting our mandate to help protect victims in the best possible way? Or do we need to expand our services and so on? So there is a lot of scope for different things to go on. And Colorado, to its credit, is doing quite a leading role in terms of the treatment side for individuals that commit the crimes.
Thank you, Dr. Coley. And it looks like we all talked about the next question as well. So I will refrain from asking you that question. Please.
I have something to add to it.
Yes, please.
If you want to get involved, there's the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking runs the human trafficking hotline. And they have, I think it's twice a year, they have training to become a hotline advocate. Because it's such a heavy subject, they constantly need people to be on the hotline because you get burned out quickly. But what you learn from the training and being an advocate is priceless. And you'll carry that with you out into the community, even when you're not a hotline advocate. It's something that you'll have for the rest of your life. And you could save lives just by learning from the hotline training and being an advocate. Even if you never became an advocate, taking the training is huge. And you could be sitting next to someone who's experiencing something, and you might be able to help them. So I strongly encourage you. It's the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking, and the hotline number is 866-455-5075. I don't know if you want that, but I highly recommend that if you want to get involved, that's a great way to do it. It might even coincide with your studies in school. And that's all I wanted to say.
I can definitely attest to it, because once I became a CASA, my life trajectory has changed, and the way I approach everything in my life has changed. So I totally attest to that thing about learning. Just learn. And as I said, my last question is about how do we as an educational institution, as well as other institution, how can we improve? And we all already talked about it. So my rapid fire question, because we are running out of time, is given a magic wand, what would each and every one of you would say would be the policy that you would propose? Like in a minute. What would you think in your field of work?
Okay, well, I've testified on this bill for many years, and it got passed and then got overturned by the Supreme Court. So if I had a magic wand, I would lift the statute of limitations for child sexual abuse. That was a huge win for me when it happened in 2022. And it was ripped out from underneath us in 2023. And it was literally devastating to me. I've been fighting to get that statute lifted since 1993. And it was supposed to be on the ballot this year. And unfortunately, one half of the political spectrum didn't think that was a good idea. So stay tuned. Next year, there will be more about it. And I highly, highly recommend that you get involved with that. If we may need people petitioning, contact the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault. They're big advocates, and I testify on through them. So that's what I would do. If I had a magic wand, I would get that statute lifted.
Thank you. Just so to go on it, what is the current statute limitation?
Lovely. It's 6 years from the date you turn 18.
Thank you.
If I had a magic wand, I would make a mirror image for the perpetrators or people that are coming into any part of a system, whether it's mental health, substance use, criminal justice, but they are able to be either identified or they're willing to acknowledge that they are engaging in intimate partner violence. I would do a mirror image of what you're talking about down there, Rachel, where we have a one-stop shop and we intervene early. And it takes money and it takes will and it takes humanizing offenders, but treatment works It works for a lot of people. It may not work for everybody. It may not give the exact results that we all hope. So we might be aiming for the stars and we might hit the top of the peak, but it does make a difference. And the earlier we intervene, the more victims that we prevent.
So this question is actually kind of scary, I think. I was just like, oh no, because you want to say the most important special thing, right? Both of your answers are fantastic. But thinking about what we were saying about prevention, I think I just go back to education and having stronger mandates around education throughout K through 12, but then also in institutions of higher education in terms of what young folks have to learn about relationships and consent and boundaries and all of these things that would be so helpful in terms of how we engage with ourselves, but then how we engage with others. That would make a really big difference in terms of why these forms of violence keep happening. So I think if we coupled that with all of these things, that would be probably something that I would wave. I mean, obviously the magic wand answer, we're not just talking about policies that this just wouldn't happen anymore. But that seems pretty grandiose, so I don't think that that's very realistic. But I think education is really realistic and one of our greatest solutions that we don't tap into quite enough. And then I'll just also add, if I had a second magic wand, that I would also love for more men to get involved in this movement. We need to hear from people who are not women, and men need to hear from other men about this issue because they hear white ladies like me honestly talk about it all the time, and they're like, yeah, whatever, I don't care about that. But when men hear other men talk about these forms of violence and talk about healthy relationships and all those things, they engage differently. So more men, please.
Yeah, the data does show that there is interpersonal violence in men as well, which has not been, talked about. Thank you.
So I was thinking about that response and thought, oh gosh, let me come up with something, but I couldn't think of anything. And then when I finally did, Catherine responded on, that was part of my response, but that's okay, because I'm going to take it a little step further and think, okay, I'm going to go beyond policy. And I'm going to say, and as Catherine mentioned earlier in one of her responses, there's so much money allocated to responding. I mean, we're just doing a Band-Aid approach. So if I had a magic wand, I would want money to go into prevention. I think that is really the key to ending all types of violence, is really looking at prevention. I did a healthy relationships workshop with men, and they were like, why didn't we learn this back in the day? Why am I just learning this now? And so I thought there's just not enough money going into prevention work. And so that's my magic wand.
Totally agree with all of you. And I agree with Catherine. If we start from K to 12 level, we will change quite a lot of lives, the trajectory of lives. Thank you. At this point of time, I would like to open up for questions to all the audience.
Yeah. Is it on? Yeah. How would you say is the biggest factor in how would you say for help for men to speak about what they've gone through, or kind of I know there's toxic masculinity, but that's also a big factor into why men don't speak up and they just keep it under wraps.
Sure. I thank you for the question. I really always so thrilled when people who identify as male to come to seek our services, and I always ensure that I thank them for the courageousness it took to come and ask for help, because we live in a society that there's so much stigma, whether you're in a same-sex relationship or especially in a heterosexual relationship, because you hear things like "man up," why can't you, control your woman or something like that. But when an abuse can look so different. I mean, it doesn't have to be physical. It can, and I have dealt with so many survivors who have identified as male, who the abuse was emotional, psychological, financial. And so it really makes it as a society hard to really come forward and seek that. And so harm is harm, hurt is hurt. And I encourage anyone to not judge, not hold um, um, any judgment at all towards anyone who identifies as being harmed, and encourage people to talk about it and know that these don't just happen in heterosexual relationships, that any identity can experience this abuse. And I just don't think we're talking enough about it, and there's not enough awareness about the different identities, because as was mentioned earlier, the statistics that we have, and of course statistics are based on people reporting, there are more female identified victims of abuse because they're the ones that come forward, because a lot of the services are really directed for those who identify as female. I mean, it wasn't until recent times that domestic violence shelters opened up to trans and male identifying survivors. And so we're way behind on how we are sharing the support that we offer to survivors of all identities. So we're very, very behind on that, and a lot of work to be done.
May I also add on that, in terms of programs for people that have perpetrated domestic violence, we have programs for females who have perpetrated, we have programs for LGBTQ plus community. We recognise on that side that violence is not constrained to male versus female traditional style relationships. We know that violence happens in all types of intimate relationships. We have in our standards and guidelines some guidelines about that. We have an additional process where approved providers get approved to work with female clients, they get approved to work with LGBTQ plus clients, and so on and so forth. So on that side of it, we know that that's a struggle in the survivor side to kind of accommodate that breadth. But on the treatment side for perpetrators, we have that. And then I would also say, you know, if you know of somebody, or if that ever is an issue for you personally, you can always volunteer to go to a domestic violence offender treatment program. I think the kind of key phrase is it's an accountability and an acceptance model. Like, there is a high level of accountability in DV treatment. That's why there's a proportion that just do not complete, because they cannot kind of live up to the accountability that's required in that model. But for those that are working towards it, there's an incredibly high level of acceptance. We know it takes an enormous amount of courage for anybody to say, I've hurt another person and I know I need some help to change that. And all of our providers know that.
From my perspective on the human trafficking end, the good news is that male victimization is becoming, it's a lot more, we're putting a lot more attention toward it, because we ignored that population for so long, which is terribly egregious that we did. Because if you look at, for instance, the Catholic Church, I mean, it's rampant. And Boy Scouts of America, and really a lot of the religious institutions, they use that power and control, and they victimize males. And thankfully, the human trafficking, anti-human trafficking field is really shining a spotlight on male victims. I don't remember exactly your question, but I know it had to do with male victimization, and I'm happy to report that in human trafficking, we're looking at all male identifying human beings, and particularly also in the LGBTQ plus community, because they are extremely vulnerable to human trafficking. And it's heartbreaking, but I'm glad that we're putting some attention on it.
I just wanted to know if there's anything that particularly stands out in research, even though there's minimal research that talks about DSM kind of personality traits like narcissism. Is there anything like that rises to the top as far as the pattern of what you might see in offenders?
Thank you for the question. The answer is yes, and there's a reasonable degree of research that looks at that stuff. So, research into risk factors for intimate partner violence, both that's criminal and that's not criminal, or it's more psychological, emotional. We can end up with a laundry list that's about 25 to 35 kind of factors long, some of which include those personality traits that might be experienced to a degree, and when they are really extreme, we call them a disorder. And yes, you're right, narcissism is one that comes up in there. People might be familiar with antisocial traits, attitudes, impulsivity. That's a big factor, at least in the group of individuals who end up being convicted. There's maybe you might call a subgroup or a kind of a subtype, and they will not only have intimate partner violence, they'll have a whole lot of other criminality as well. And so you'll see a lot of those antisocial traits there. We also see what used to be in that cluster B group in the prior version of the DSM-4 or the DSM-5, and it so like what they call borderline, which is kind of real emotional instability and some sort of identity instability, or not. There's issues in identity formation and the kind of stability of the self, and we see that can be a part of risk for DV as well.
I was just curious if any of you know or can speak on how a lot of times LGBT and even male victims are re-victimized by even first responders who are not well trained on how to deal with the intimate partner violence between or against men or between LGBT relationships. I'm speaking like from experience and also research I did in grad school on, and there's just not enough of it. So I'm curious if any of you know of any programs that are trying to do better, or any knowledge around how these first responders are trained, or the lack thereof of training in those situations.
I can't speak to first responder training, but that is a great issue to bring up. But it's a general issue of how do we train our first responders to respond when intimate partner violence is the call out. And so we know that where there is specialized training, we get a better response, because and we also know that the regulations and the policies have to be set up in the right way. So, and I think in past times we've sometimes had to have this is the person who is the offender and this is the person who's the victim. And I think in those non-traditional kind of relationships, that's where it gets very difficult for first responders who are not familiar with that to necessarily know how to make those distinctions, even if that distinction is relevant. I'm aware we have some local stuff going on. We know we have what we call DV task force, where we kind of create local kind of connections of people in different communities to try and look at these issues on a local basis. And we know that we have law enforcement involved in a number of those in our communities. We also know that we have some policing. I'm familiar with the model that's being built out in Fort Collins at the moment, where we have specialists, kind of like detectives, police, all of that sort of stuff to do with DV. Like in some communities we have for sex offending as well. And those programs are resource intensive. They take an effort from leadership and an effort from the people on the ground to do it, but they do tend to do a more effective job, I think, at that first level of response. And we can wrap into that more training around the nuances of LGBTQ, about identities. We can train more about trying to help people learn to be more open and accepting, and kind of examine some of their own beliefs that they may be bringing to their interactions as well. I'm not sure if somebody else has got other experiences with victims.
I just wanted to share that my department, we just got post training, which is police officer. I don't know what the ST stands for. But we got, it's now going to be mandated that every law enforcement agency in the state of Colorado receive law enforcement human trafficking training. And yeah, it's like monumental that we did this. It took us 7 years. And they just, yeah. And the one thing I want to share about human trafficking that I didn't really touch on is that it intersects with so many other crimes, including domestic violence. And so by having law enforcement learn about human trafficking, they're going to learn about that intersection of domestic violence, intimate partner violence. They're going to learn all about that and what to look for and how to treat the victims when they come across them. So yeah, we're and it's a almost a 2-hour training program. So it's going to be online or in person, and we're just thrilled that we get to do it. We're just thrilled.
You just have to Google for the training program. Is it available for the whole public, or is it just for police?
You can definitely go to thisishumantrafficking.com and you'll be connected to training. The post training is for law enforcement. That's the one that's going to be mandated for all law enforcement officers. But we do have an HT 101 that's open to anybody who wants to take it. So you can find that through our This Is Human Trafficking. And if you just go to the website, you'll learn a ton about human trafficking.
Thank you.
Hi. So I was a few minutes late, so it's possible that this was discussed and I missed it, but I have heard several times in this discussion a distinction between perpetrators and survivors. And I know that you all know that oftentimes perpetrators are survivors. And I'd like to believe that the public also knows that, but I'm curious to hear what you all do in your work in terms of like interfacing with the public, if that education is something that you do, if you feel like it's an important thing to educate the public about, if you think it's something that the public maybe already knows, because I think that especially offenders who commit sex offense crimes are often also survivors. And so, and I know that our cultures can be really harsh towards sex offenders, people with sex offense convictions. So I'm curious to hear just that you all work professionally in this field and you talk so much about the importance of education. So I'm curious to hear sort of like what that looks like for you guys, talking about that with the public.
So something that I think is really important when we do education, or at least the framework that we try to come from, is like really like talking a lot about the normalization of violence, right? And that often like violence is a learned behavior. Like there are actually like a very small percentage of people in the world who are just prone to being violent, right? It's a very, very small percentage. So when we're talking about these forms of interpersonal violence, whether it be relationship violence or sexual violence, those are learned behaviors, right? So they learned that from someone. And it's not uncommon that people who are causing harm to others had harm caused to them, right? Like hurt people. Like it's just very common. So we do note that with a caveat that those experiences can help explain like someone's behavior, but it doesn't excuse somebody's behavior, right? Because not everybody who has experienced those forms of violence goes on to then further perpetrate that. So we can't really use that as an excuse for why it happens, but it helps to explain maybe why people engage in certain behaviors. And here's like, I do think that offender work is so important. It's not something I can personally do, but I'm so grateful for the people who do, because it's just not like, as a survivor myself, like I just can't, that's not a realm that I can work in and like feel like I could go back home. Like I just can't do that. But it's so needed because like people who perpetuate like these forms of violence are still going to be members of our society. And ultimately we need those behaviors to change, right? So there has to be some kind of recidivism mechanism here to make sure that people then can reintegrate into society and not perpetuate these forms of harm, right? And you can't really talk about violence without also talking about trauma, right? And so we try and integrate all of those things together. And it can sometimes be really, really hard to look at things with like that empathy and humanity lens, especially when you're working with survivors and they're telling you the horrible things that somebody else has done to them. And you're just like, wow, like how creative people can get in abuse just blows my mind. And that can make it really difficult, but that's why we need people working on both sides, right? So I think that has to be a big part of the education too. So I'm never like, oh my God, I can't believe that people work with offenders just because I work with survivors. Like both sides need to happen. We just need the right people on those sides that are doing that work. And I just happen to not be that person. I don't know if that answered your question or started to.
Well, if I can add in there as well, since I'm, yeah, yes, since there's kind of that. Well, I don't personally do it anymore. But we do have this role. You're right. Okay. And I think when we had that question, which was so difficult to answer, was what causes this, right? And so we know that adverse childhood experiences, other traumatic experiences is a really significant part in the pathway for an adult to turn out where they're perpetuating this stuff in their own relationships. So we know that in our standards, we have a couple of what we call treatment competencies that we require the individual who's doing the domestic violence offender treatment to achieve their successful discharge. And one is to be able to I think I'm going to get the wording wrong. One is about being able to sort of understand or be able to make some connections between their own intergenerational violence and their experience. And it's not necessarily to hammer that into people. It's to try to ask people to maybe be open to the idea that things that went on in their past actually taught them some things. And this is part of what's got to be kind of looked at and changed. Because as much as you might think everybody wants to come into treatment and say, yeah, it's my early childhood, that was the problem. A lot of times we know that when people are traumatized, it's the last thing they want to talk about, especially if there are things about, what it means to be a man or what it means to be tough, and that we don't show weakness and we don't kind of acknowledge the things that have gone wrong and have really maybe harmed us ourselves. So that we have one of the competencies to do with that. And then we have another competency, which is to do with the trauma reactions that happen, perhaps emotionally, that might be part of the interpersonal violence that may have connections to past trauma. And as much as we can't require, or we don't require that individuals have to do their own trauma treatment, because you can't compel that. We can compel treating domestic violence, but we can't compel people to go get your own trauma therapy. We can't do that, but we encourage people to have an openness to be able to have that conversation and start to make some of those connections. There's also some reasons why we try to keep the focus on the actual domestic violent behaviour that person's perpetuating, because it's kind of like, I think just what was said so eloquently, this is part of the explanation, but it's not an excuse. There's no excuse for violence. There's just none. That's the reality. I might be entirely compassionate to why this person was violent, because I worked with offenders for a very long time, and there's very few times where it's hard for me not to have compassion, but it's never okay. It doesn't, but we're going to help you. You need to help yourself to not do that anymore. And it's a journey, right? It's a hard and long journey. In terms of that education stuff, we have it in our standards. We tend to talk about risk factors and reasons and things like that, but we're not out there championing what I think you might be talking about, is trying to maybe humanize the people that are currently kind of seen as the villains.
Rachel, would you like to add anything?
I mean, it's hard because I've always been a victim advocate. And as I mentioned earlier, I did training with male for a job readiness program. They were all male identified. And I did a workshop on societal messaging and, what it means, gender role meanings. And there were so many disclosures of abuse that they were experiencing. And I remember asking this one question, and this person said, I never even told my wife, I never even admitted it, but I was sexually abused by my aunt. And it just really made me start thinking about how hard it is to work towards ending domestic violence if I'm not really looking at it from all aspects. It's so multifaceted and really complex that we really all need to be doing it from various means, not just survivor centered. That's important too. But if we're not really addressing it through all means, then we're not working towards ending it. And so I've never worked with offenders. except in that small indirect way. But I also find it very, very fascinating because it is just another means of working to end it.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Unfortunately, we might be at time now,
Okay.
but we are
Thank you.
not kicked out of the room just yet. So I would
Okay.
encourage everyone in here to continue the conversation. Yeah, and please enjoy the rest of the food. But I'll
Yeah,
pass it back
would-
to you.
I would like to close with a quote from Eva Mary Lewis. To be an activist is to speak. To be an advocate is to listen. Society can't move forward without both. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. And thank you for giving me the honor of moderating this panel. And what a great discussion, as she said. You're more than welcome to stay. And if anyone has questions, if you have time, we would like to continue the conversation. And I know today's topic has been a heavy topic. So please take care of every one of you. Please take care of yourself. If you need any support, please reach out to Phoenix Center, your professors, or me, and drive home safely. Thank you.